Hello? Hello? Is this working? Great. Okay, so I think we're right on time. Wow, this is actually great. Friday, last session, you've made it. I know you feel tired, but I'm AFP staff, so if I'm here and I can do this, we can all do this. We can get through it. So thanks so much for joining. I'm Laura Straumeyer. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel, this female-only panel, this international panel coming in from abroad across the pond as well. So very excited to be here. So I'm sure you've all seen in your app and read through the bios already, so you know we have here with us Emily Myers, who is actually a Scoville Fellow and Research Associate with us at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and has now moved on to the National Endowment for Democracy, where she's a Research Associate. Skyping in from the UK, we have Ruth Simpson, a Senior Lead of Development, Impact and Learning on MENA for International Alert. We have Nagina Valenti at the end, the Technical Manager on M&E for Creative Associates, and Lauren Van Meter, Senior Advisor on Peace and Security, National Democratic Institute. Wow, what an amazing panel of women. We're so excited to have you. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. So I'm not sure if you picked this session because it says the word evidence. I don't know if you picked it because it says PCVE. I don't know if you just really love the Angle Room and that's why you're here. Regardless, we're excited and we hope it's sort of a diverse set of people in the room who are maybe, PCVE all day, every day, or PCVE skeptics, M&E professionals, policymakers. We want you all here. We want you to be part of this discussion, so we're very excited to have you. And so just as a quick intro, I know that you've seen there's a lot of preventing and countering violent extremism discussions happening throughout PeaceCon, from a lot of different angles, from programming, from case studies, to do we really need this? Should we go? Should we not go? And so we wanted to make sure to pull that in as well to AFP's sort of value of learning and evaluation. And so we thought about how do we do a good session on M&E for PCVE, and realized that we didn't want anything too prescriptive, and we didn't want to promise you that we have any of the solutions. But today what we want to do is assess the evidence and lay out what we think we know or don't know or need to know about PCVE and other types of programs. So that's what we're hoping to do, and we were inspired in part by some research that Emily did with us, and as well connecting that to a broader toolkit that Ruth worked on with International Alert and UNDP. So our order will be, Ruth will lay the groundwork on sort of the broad sort of best practice, good tools for developing theories of change for PCVE. That's what we're focusing on. Emily will lay into some of what we know, what some evidence has shown us about certain theories of change, and if there's evidence in support or not. Nagina will walk us through how Creative specifically laid out some theories of change for PCVE, and Lauren will close us out thinking about the governance lens and how governance theories of change do or do not relate to PCVE. So that's what we have for you. I think each speaker will go for about 10 minutes, and we've got some slides. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ruth and pray that everything works well with the Skype. Excellent. Thank you so much, Ruth. And I know you can't, stop sharing. I know you can't see us on that second to last slide. There were lots of phones up in the room, so I do believe that chart and many others are in that broader toolkit. So I'm going to minimize you just for a moment so we can see all the other lovely slides. And we'll move over. So I think that was a really lovely overview. If you could make sure you mute yourself now, Ruth. Yes, you're good. Great. And so I will hand it over to Emily to dig into a little more about theories of change that have been tried and are continuing to be used.
Sure. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Ruth. And as Laura said, this subsector review, which I worked on while I was at AFP, was meant to take stock of the approaches that are currently being used in the peacebuilding field and understand where the evidence is the strongest, where it's the weakest, what we know about those theories. So just to give you an idea, Laura, if you want to go to the next one, thanks, of the scope of the research, we scoured for publicly available evaluations of peace/CVE programming and ended up with about 14. So it's by no means comprehensive, but we do think that it's a large enough sample size to do some sound analysis. And our ramifications or our barometers for choosing the evaluations were just, are they attempting to reduce violent extremism? So the report was asking 3 central questions. The first, as Ruth said, we know that violent extremism is intricately linked to other forms of violence, but we don't necessarily understand what's unique about it or what's unique about our programming for violent extremism. So we were hoping that by looking at the approaches that are being used for peace/CVE, we might be able to understand what some of those differences are and how they should impact both programming and evaluation. And then the next 2 questions, which are what I'm really going to focus on, are that we wanted to identify which theories of change are out there and then how strong the evidence is for each of those theories and where the gaps were, what we still needed to learn. As we were looking into these evaluations, we found that the theories of change really fell into 2 broad families. The first being identifying who is at risk of supporting or participating in violent extremism within a community and trying to design programs that address their specific grievances. And then secondly, looking at the community in a more holistic way, understanding what risks the entire community might face and designing programming for those risks. And these aren't mutually exclusive. We did find programs that did both, but in each program, one approach did tend to outweigh the other, be the more prominent approach, and that's how we categorized those. So I'll begin with approach 1. There were sort of 2 sub-theories of change to those approaches that we found. This is not to say it's the exact language that each program used or even that they explicitly articulated it, but through our analysis, it's how we grouped them. So the first was that by increasing at-risk individuals' perceptions of their own empowerment, their own ability to affect change, we would reduce their proclivity to supporting and participating in violent extremism. If they're given peaceful pathways to make change, they won't feel the need to do so violently. And you'll see in each approach just some of the associated indicators and the activities that went along with those approaches, just for context, but I'll really focus on the evidence behind the theory. So this theory of change, the programs that employed it, there was very strong evidence that they were capable of influencing youth perceptions of their own efficacy, their own involvement in their community, but that didn't necessarily translate into an increased perception of their ability to affect change within their community. And a big reason for that, one case, for example, found that youth through focus group interviews were consistently saying that they felt that they had achieved greater skills through the program, but that their community wasn't open to their ideas, or there weren't clear pathways for them to apply those skills for positive change. And that resulted in their attitudes towards the use of violence, the use of political violence, not really shifting. So this approach works only if it's coupled with broader community programming that allows those individual changes to have somewhere to go. If the community isn't open to the youth's increased engagement, then it really doesn't shift the needle on their support for violence. The next approach within that first individual body of theories of change is providing youth with tangible skills, both for social and for economic advancement, in order to decline their support for political violence, their engagement in violent extremism. This theory of the 5 that we looked at had the weakest evidence. Youth employment and outreach programs failed to demonstrate any significant difference between treatment and control areas on indicators that were designed to measure support for VE, or views towards violent extremism. A couple of reasons for that might be that these sorts of programs really face 2 major barriers in changing attitudes towards violent extremism. The first is that other research shows that it's relative economic position and not absolute economic position that's really a driver of violent extremism. So increasing one person's opportunities for economic advancement doesn't necessarily change the broad context, the economic environment that they're in, and their perceptions of how their own position matches up with others in their community. And the second, which isn't unrelated, is that though these at-risk individuals might now have greater skills for economic and social advancement, similar to the first theory in this family, that doesn't mean that suddenly the environment is conducive to them using those skills and benefiting from those skills. So this was, again, a theory where they might be able to change that individual's circumstances, but until the broader context is shifted, it hasn't been able to demonstrate any sort of significant influence on their attitudes towards violent extremism. Moving on to the second approach, the broader community approach, the first theory that we found within that was governance related. So if governments and security institutions are perceived as trustworthy, accountable, and responsive to citizen needs, then levels of violent extremism will go down. This was a really interesting theory in terms of the mix of the evidence that was out there, because improvements to community-government relationship, especially those dealing with how security apparatuses treat citizens, resulted in large improvements on peace/CVE relevant indicators like the level of perceived community exclusion that's been perpetrated by the government, or behavioral changes that serve the goals of peace/CVE, like a greater likelihood to report suspicious activity to trusted community institutions. But at the same time, the way the evidence has been gathered makes it difficult to draw an empirical connection between government-based peace/CVE programming and evidence for decline in support or decline in participation in violent extremism. Oftentimes, there weren't baseline surveys or comparison control groups. Obviously, it's very difficult to do that, especially in a context where there are major governance challenges, but it does mean that the body of evidence quantitatively is less robust. Again, though, complicating the issue, the evidence that when we fail to improve government-community relationships, risks to violent extremism go up is huge. There's such a large body of evidence indicating that when these community-government relationships are marked by distrust and abuse and senses of marginalization, the risks for violent extremism are incredibly, incredibly high. So this theory really suffered from a dearth of evidence based on practicality and not logical issues with the theory. It's clear that there's something there. It's just that the state of evidence doesn't necessarily support those connections in a rigorous way yet. So moving on to the next approach within this community-based family of theories of change. If trusted leaders in the community are empowered to understand and mitigate the risks of violent extremism, then they will exert that influence, driving levels of VE down. It's the theory of change for this family. Qualitative evidence for this theory of change was incredibly strong, but again, there was less quantitative evidence that supported it. So in focus groups and key informant interviews, it was clear that local counter-narratives, which were created and disseminated by trusted community leaders, were very, very powerful in combating VE. And when you one study compared similar communities that had differing levels of violent extremism and found these counter-narratives to be one of the most prominent protective factors. In the same vein, community leaders proved very successful at facilitating intergroup connections and getting people from disparate groups to cooperate with one another. By way of example, when they cooperated with, for example, other religious leaders, that seemed through focus group interviews and key informant interviews to kind of trickle down and pervade the way that the rest of the community viewed the other. And a sort of mapping study found that these established, trusted community institutions and leaders were the first point of contact for members of the community who wanted to seek help, who thought that somebody else might be at risk in their community. So it shows that, again, like the first approach, it's promising and highly supported by qualitative evidence, but it hasn't been demonstrated quantitatively. This is we're missing approach 2.3, but that's okay, I can tell you about it. So if the third approach within this community-based family was that if members of distinct groups have opportunities to discuss their ideas with one another, to connect with one another in a more real way, then they'll be more tolerant and levels of violent extremism will go down. So this really dealt with social cohesion. I think it actually is up there. That's just my own eyes deceiving me. And so in this theory, there was a lot of convincing evidence that social cohesion itself does increase resilience to violent extremism, but there was less evidence that it was peace-building programming affecting that change. So the cases mostly focused on examining existing social dynamics rather than analyzing how peace-building programming has shifted or created new dynamics. So the idea that social cohesion and interaction between diverse communities is a powerful tool for creating resilience to violent extremism is strong, it's clear, but the peace-building field, at least from these 14 evaluations, hasn't necessarily been able to show that they are the decisive factor or one of the decisive factors in creating that cohesion. So in conclusion, from analysis of these sort of 5 broad theories, it seems that programs which take the whole of community approach are more effective in changing attitudes and declining support for violent extremism than those programs which target at-risk individuals. And there was no one theory of change that emerged as the catch-all and be-all for Peace/CVE, but within those two approaches, the community one was consistently more effective and able to affect change on its own, whereas the targeted approach really needed to be coupled with broader community programming in order to change the dynamics. So just a couple of hypotheses for why that might be, what came out of the research, is that global grievances are sometimes more powerful drivers to violent extremism than individual grievances. So by focusing on the individual, these programs might sort of be selling themselves short. There's also no guarantee that programs can successfully identify who is at risk. So several of the cases we examined, upon reflection, the programs noted that they left out individuals who might not obviously be at risk, but actually were, and ignored the effects of VE on large swaths of the population, one of which being women, as Ruth noted. Program evaluations consistently articulated that lack of gendered analysis impeded the effectiveness of their initiatives by assuming that women aren't vulnerable to VE or aren't engaging with VE groups in the same way that men are. And lastly, there's the issue of stigmatization, which I think we're all familiar with. By naming somebody as at risk and focusing on them specifically rather than the ways in which their community is being affected, programs might actually be undermining their own effectiveness. So the broad takeaway is that the community approach seemed to work better than the individual, and I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Emily. Seeing a lot of photos still. So I know, I think all our hard copies were taken, but this entire report is absolutely available on AFP's website. The list, I have resources, the list of evaluations I believe is included. If you feel like we missed something, we want to know that, feel free to send it along. So next we'll move on to Nagina, who will dig down a little more specifically into how Creative has thought through some of these issues.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you all for being here on this Friday afternoon. So I will talk about Creative's approach to designing theories of change for countering violent extremism programs. At Creative, we take what is known as the public health model to CVE, which begins with the premise that violence is an illness and it needs to be treated through prevention, intervention, and recovery. Creative first tested this public health model in its violence prevention programs in Latin America and the Caribbean by addressing the factors that spark and sustain gang violence. By adapting the public health approach or model to a PCVE context, Creative took the four-step approach to violence prevention through prevention, intervention, interdiction. So primary prevention for the general population in a high violence area, secondary prevention for those most at risk of getting involved in violence, tertiary prevention for those most at risk of, such as reentry for former members of violent groups, and law enforcement interventions for more hardened offenders. So in this slide, you can see this approach, which is broken into 4 stages. And the way we look at it is, although each stage focuses on the particular target group, it requires the whole of society approach, which is something that Emily just talked about. So what have we done to get to this theory of change? Or actually, there are 4 of them, but you will see. So to develop our theories of change, we held theory of change sessions with every practice area at Creative. We looked at the programs that ranged from stabilization to education to economic growth. And we split CVE programming into 2 buckets, CVE specific and CVE relevant. CVE-specific programming targets those most at risk of recruitment and radicalization. And then the CVE-relevant programming shapes the environment, reduces political and economic grievances, and reduces vulnerability of radicalization. This is where you can see CVE mainstreamed into other development programming like education and economic growth. And CVE-relevant programming tends to focus on the prevention end of the spectrum. So Creative actually implements programs that are both CVE-specific and CVE-relevant, which is why we felt important that we have a theory of change that would guide the design of our future P and CVE programs. So here you can see this is our, based on that exercise that I just mentioned, here we developed the following overall theory of change. If community resilience is strengthened, if youth are empowered, if former fighters are successfully reintegrated, and if the political environment reduces the likelihood that ideology-based groups will use violence to achieve their objectives, then VEO influence will be reduced. To get to this overall theory of change, as I mentioned, we did several theories of change. We looked at each stage and developed a theory of change and an objective to address each stage, focusing on each target group. So here you see our first theory of change, which has an accompanying objective, which is Creative seeks to leverage community strength to resist the encroachment of VEOs. Can everybody read this theory of change? I want it for the sake of time, not read it, but I will. So the theory of change itself is if a community shares values, if its citizens can go about daily life without fear, and if the government is perceived to be effective, if there is economic opportunity, and if radical and violent organizations are directly addressed, then communities will be more resilient to the encroachment of VEOs. So the idea being, if we can identify sources of fragility and resilience in communities, we can program around them to mitigate drivers of recruitment into VEOs. Lessons that we learned from the community of practice indicate that primary issues at the community level include fear and recourse, especially in terms of the security sector, livelihoods, social cohesion, and fairness and hope through equitable and transparent governance. Additionally, we view P and CVE ultimately as a competition for influence, meaning that the goal is not to counter what VEOs are offering recruits, both in terms of narratives and incentives, but rather to address the underlying grievances to undermine the credibility of their narratives and to provide an alternative future that's better than what the VEOs are offering. To do this, we have to identify credible and trusted voices in the communities, to work through and recognize that many of the communities we work in will have endured some kind of a trauma and are in need of reconciliation. So as you look at across the intermediate results and interventions, you can start to see what this looks like in practice. So is it, for example, what does it mean to address livelihoods in VE setting, right? Is it access to economic networks? Is it capable government institutions? So, and the purple column over here is what we do in terms of mirroring what the VEOs are offering and mirroring those better alternatives that I just mentioned. So our second theory of change addresses the following objective. Creative seeks to empower individual youth to reject ideological radicalization and recruitment with the following theory of change. If at-risk youth are personally safe, if they have agency, if they are included in positive groups in the community, and if VEO influence is directly challenged, then youth will be resistant to radicalization and VEO recruitment. So to craft this objective, we looked at individual vulnerability and resiliency factors through the lenses of personal security, agency, and inclusion. As you have probably noticed, there are a lot of similarity between community and individual level interventions. Often, the factors that make a person more resilient are the same that make communities community resilience, with the theory being that resilient individuals make resilient communities. That said, there are specific components of resilience, such as critical thinking, psychosocial support, and an empowered sense of identity that lend themselves more to resilience of an individual. So just like in Objective 1, on the left side, we have included the competition for influence column in purple, right side on your side, to mirror the advancement recruitment tactics of VEOs like ISIS. So if you look across the intermediate results, you can start to see what this looks like in practice. For example, what does it mean to address personal security in the VE setting? Is it access to safe spaces? Is it security forces not abusive? What is it? Our third theory of change has an accompanying objective, which is creative seeks to strengthen the ability of society to reintegrate former fighters and their families in order to reduce recidivism. The following theory of change to support this is: if national level policies are established, if former fighters have access to rehabilitation and reintegration support services, and if families play a positive role in the reintegration process, and if communities are willing and able to accept former fighters, then former fighters will be less vulnerable to recidivism and acts of violence. So we conceptualize reintegration into two buckets. There are foreign terrorist fighters who left their home country to join an international organization, such as a case of a young man from the suburb of Brussels, who traveled to Syria to join ISIS, and local fighters who join local groups and therefore are at a higher risk of committing violence against their own communities, such as the case that happens in Nigeria, Afghanistan, and the Philippines. It is important to make this distinction because the challenges around the reintegration of these fighters into their communities will differ significantly between these two groups. Given the legal challenges around directly engaging former fighters, many US government implementing partners, like Creative, have chosen to approach this from a community perspective, wherein our interventions seek to monitor and increase a community's absorption capacity. Essentially, we work with communities to prepare to receive former fighters by ensuring community needs are addressed and that reintegrating former fighters won't put additional economic strains on the community. We also work with communities to improve perceptions and reduce stigma around former fighters through transitional justice mechanisms and targeted communication campaigns. While some of the sub-objectives and intermediate results go beyond the scope of typical USAID-funded programs, our main funder is USAID, we felt that those components were critical to the theory of change and thus should not be ignored. These components, such as segregated, non-abusive detention facilities, can be addressed by other programs in the area and through close collaboration with local government and donor-funded initiatives. For our purposes, reintegration programming typically focuses around preparing the community by setting up referral networks and support services, training families on how to help their returning fighters, and by working with the local media outlets to disseminate information to educate the public on the process of reintegrating former fighters. So our final theory of change, with the following objective: Creative seeks to enable a political environment that reflects the will of the people in order to mitigate the risk that ideology-based groups will use violence to achieve political objectives, have a following theory of change. If a culture of tolerance and peace is reinforced, if there is a legal framework that allows nonviolent political groups transparency groups transparent and consistent access to political power, and if the established government is perceived to be legitimate by citizens, then ideology-based groups will be less likely to use violence to achieve political objectives. This objective is particularly looking, or primarily looking at national level politics and how to improve governance and communication thereof to reduce perceptions of marginalization. Currently, we don't have, for the sake of time, we currently don't have this kind of programs, but this is something to consider when you are designing programs at the national level. And so that's why we created this following theory of change. And just really quickly, to support our theories of change and to measure creatives programs focusing on CVE, we also design an index of indicators, primarily focusing on CVE programming. And so this is just to kind of give you an example of two output level and two outcome level indicators. And in addition, we also designed an index of sentinel indicators. Those of you who are familiar with the complexity-aware monitoring know that sentinel indicators are one of the ways to monitor the environment. And so our indicators are grouped into 5 domains, which are governance, rule of law, safe and secure environment, social well-being, and economic conditions. Each of these domains has about 2 to 5 indicators that can be tailored to the context that they are operating in. So I'll stop here at this point, and I'll be happy to answer more questions in the future.
Thank you. I will probably block my own slides, but they're not pretty, or so I think that's probably fine. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today. I just have recently joined the National Democratic Institute, and and my background and training is in peace building. And NDI, I think, had the foresight to bring on someone who's trained in peace building into their governance work, recognizing that it's working more and more in conflict-affected states and on issues that bisect with peace-building issues. So a lot of this is my thinking a little bit on how governance and peace-building might start to come together and theories of change around those 2 areas. So the first thing I'd like to do is say that NDI entered this CVE and PVE space very, very carefully. And the reason was that, they did not want to see a lot of their democracy and governance work subsumed by PVE, CVE. And for 2 reasons. Number one, because they wanted to maintain their identity as a governance and democracy institution. And second, because you want to maintain the effectiveness of your work, right? And so did democracy and governance work necessarily have an effect on preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism? But that said, I think we are all beginning to realize how important governance is to preventing violent extremism and CVE. So, with the help of NED, they applied for funding to look at how governance programming might be effective in this PVE, CVE space. And what they did, I still got to say we with NDI. I'm so new that I'm like, what we did at NDI was they designed participatory action programming, which I think is really interesting. So the groups were brought together, politicians, local leaders, civil society, and community leaders were all brought together around an issue. But coming out of that issue, there was no expectation of what they would do to solve the problem. So they analyzed the problem together, they came up with a solution together, and then they enacted that solution together. And the studies were done in Indonesia, Burkina Faso, and Morocco. And in Indonesia, the issue that was raised was around religious hate speech that is becoming more and more prevalent in the Indonesian elections as more radical politicians look to enter democratic institutions. In Morocco, the issue was around youth and youth engagement in the north. And then in Burkina Faso, the issue was specifically around CVE and diagnosing in Ouagadougou what were some of the things that community and security forces could do together. I will say, coming out of that, the solutions were entirely those that were selected by the group. So there was nothing preordained about this. In Indonesia, the solution was actually to create a network that would institutionalize moderate voices around the election. In Morocco, they established a youth council that would advise the president of the region around youth issues. And in Burkina Faso, they identified certain security mechanisms between the security forces and the community. 2 out of 3 of those programs developed what I would call political engagement processes. They continue today to engage in these political processes. And in looking at this, I think what we can call these political engagement processes in some ways social contracts. And so this is what's beginning to be developed as a social contract between citizens and governments around what we do around PVE and CVE processes. And I think this is really important, and I'll put this as a gap, is that we often talk about CVE as a degradation of social contracts, right? We understand when the social contracts break apart, fragility ensues and allows a window for violent extremists to come in. But we don't have as much evidence and good knowledge around how we build social contracts between governance and populations. And one of the things that I think was interesting around this NDI study that I was thinking about was some of these engagement processes that were identified were bottom up, bottom to top. One of the engagement processes was middle up, out, and horizontal, and one of the engagement processes was top down. And so I would like to refine this theory of change here to say if governance programs deliver democracy both as process and outcome, then they will reduce VE activities. This is a theory to be tested, but I would refine that by saying, what does that social contract process look like? Does it come from the bottom up? Does it come from the top down? And which one of these social contract processes are more effective? So I would refine that theory of change. The second theory of change that I'll put out there, it's a little provocative, but it's one that I've been thinking a lot about. I actually was one of the researchers in the studies that you looked at. So I did the study, a 2-year study on community resilience to violent extremism in Kenya. And I looked at communities that were similarly at risk, but those that tipped into violence and those didn't, and what explained the difference, what were the resilience factors. So I was able to isolate some of the resilience factors. And the first resilience factor that I isolated was that communities that did not let or could manage predatory states were less resilient to violent extremism, okay? So communities that had community-led security groups that worked with each other and worked with the state to manage the state and keep out predatory security forces were less likely to have VE activity in those communities. And what this says to me, and I can go into it in the question and answer as to why that was, because predatory security actors both increase risk for violent extremism, but they also reduce community resilience. So they hit them on both sides, okay? And so one of the things that I think on the governance side and in the PVE side that we need to be thinking about in our programming more is how do we find mechanisms that allow communities to buffer themselves from predatory state actors, okay? With the realization that the long-term goal is good governance, but in the interim, what do we do with these bad state actors? So that's another theory of change that I'll put out there. The third theory of change that I'd like to suggest here is both the NDI study in Indonesia and the study that I did with Theodolan in Kenya around elections began to show something very, very interesting. We often think of VE groups in terms of individual radicalization, But what we're beginning to see more and more is that VE groups are actually looking to manipulate and undermine democratic processes. So from the governance side, this is very interesting. So in Indonesia, the manipulation was around the elections, trying to get more and more radical politicians elected. So Indonesians very much saw radicalization not as an or hate speech not as an individual radicalization process, but as an undermining of democratic institutions. In Kenya, the same thing. We saw in the elections in Kenya that violent extremist groups moved into this hate speech messaging around election violence, and they began to encourage Muslim populations on the Mombasa coast to disengage from the elections, okay? These were going to be secular governments that aren't going to promote your interests anyway. Look at what they do in terms of grievances. So it's essentially a policy of disenfranchisement. So I think that's another area and a theory of change that we need to start looking at is we need to start monitoring what these VE groups are doing around undermining democratic processes and institutions and come up with programming out of it. The final issue that I really tried to raise when I was leading research at USIP, and I still think there needs to be a lot of work done around this, is that I've talked about the state as a predatory actor, but I've also talked about the state as a positive actor in this space. And we just don't know enough about when the state should be involved in preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism, and when it shouldn't. And one of the examples, and under what conditions. And I think there needs to be a lot more research around this and developing theories of change around state-led interventions. For example, in Indonesia, the moderate religious leaders were engaging the state very, very effectively on coming up with tools to help the state moderate more radical hate speech, okay? In Kenya, the state tried to bring in moderate religious leaders in communities to counter violent extremist narratives in ways that actually undermined them security and got some of them killed. So how does the state work with moderate religious leaders and under what conditions? How does the state work with civil society organizations on what conditions? And another theory, and then public-private partnerships. And I think more understanding and more comparative analysis across countries and conditions, I think would be very helpful in terms of governance gaps. And I'm out of time and I'm done.
Great. Thanks so much to all of you. We'll pull Ruth back up onto the screen. So Ruth, we can see you now. And so we have about a half hour for discussion. I'm sure there's lots of questions in the room. I'll just start quickly off with my favorite question as someone who's not at all an evaluation person, but my job is to translate evidence into advocacy. So my first question would be, in general, is there anything you think we can learn from all of this for policy? Are there things that donors need to know? Are there things that advocates need to be doing differently? How do we translate that into action in DC, in New York, and beyond? Anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I'll only give an example in terms of policymakers, but I think actually, and I may have difficulty describing it, but we do monitoring and evaluation on programming, but I think we need to elevate our monitoring and evaluation to practice. And what I mean by that is we need to evaluate CVE and PVE practices across that we use in these situations, much like you were trying to do, and look at what's the most effective tools we have within those practice areas. I've seen this done around preventing electoral violence when you say, there's state electoral management, there is security sector interventions, there's peace messaging, there's youth messaging. So what across those tools are most effective when it comes to intervening around this type of violence? And I think we need to be doing the same thing around CVE, so it's not just what effective programmings, but what is the most effective practice. And that, I think, will help policymakers not only make decisions about programming, but also where funding goes.
I'd like to add to this. I didn't get to talk about some of our programs that we have been implementing, but there were 3 pilot programs that Creative just recently completed. And they were very short, about a year and a half programs done on preventing, countering violent extremism. We would like to have more time, not just for the implementation, but also more time to do an evaluation down the road to see whether there is an impact from the programs that we have implemented. And I think on being as an evaluator, I think it's important that we do have those resources and that, we're not just here to implement and spend the money and then forget about that program. We do want to know what is it that we're leaving behind. Did this work or it didn't?
Great. So we'll start with the room. If you could, Lulu's got the mic just to make sure Ruth gets everything, and then maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time.
My name is Hisham Jabi. I'm at MSI Tetra Tech. The question is about the theory of change related to countering local narrative, I believe, which sounded effective. I think I would like to look at this from unintended consequences issue perspective and do no harm. I was looking at a very thorough manual done by CVE organization in the Middle East, and I am bilingual. I speak Arabic and English, and I was really surprised. The language is very, very unbelievably misleading from Arabic perspective. It's very strong. It's very offending. It's very, I don't know what to say. I mean, you get the message. That's one perspective. The other perspective is, one thing came to my mind is these terms, which actually, and language and narrative, developed by local people, but it was developed within US government programming and within certain policies and certain jargons we have to adhere to. But also what attracted my attention is there are certain language or words being misunderstood because it is being used in a regional conflict in a different positive manner. For example, the terrorist in a certain conflict means a freedom fighter in others. And you have actually conflict has been going on since the 80s, where the Arab young people has been receiving messages that these guys are bad, these guys are, the same language I saw in that report in Arabic. It's very dangerous, because you are telling these guys in the Arab world that these guys are bad, but in another conflict, in other context, they've been seen as a freedom fighter. So we have to be a little bit careful when we develop theory of change to understand not the regional conflict context in Idlib, but to understand what's going on around across the border. It's very complex, and it's a word of warning for those, because we have to really understand the context in the Middle East in the era of social media, much more sophisticated than 10 years ago. So that's my comment.
Hi, everyone. Carlotta from Search for Common Ground. I guess as an M&E practitioner, what I struggle the most when we work on CVE or PVE programs, and I think it's like very much more on the line of what he was saying, it's that violent extremism, based on our experience and on the research that we have done, it's interpreted differently by different people. So perceptions changes. And just an example, when we did conflict analysis and a series of conflict scans on coastal Kenya, when we ask communities what is violent extremism for you, if adults especially were pointing at young unemployed children, right? Like, or young unemployed youth. So they were for us, like violent extremists as youth that join gangs and then create violence within our communities. And from a donor perspective, most of the time it's related has a most of like religious exception. So I think, I mean, I want to hear from you if you would ever like had to face that, but how do you address that when what the donor has in mind and what communities have in mind when you talk about violent extremism is not exactly the same. And even within the communities, there's no agreement. So for instance, like even when we ask when we try to make the link between conflict and violent extremism, dynamics change. So, yeah.
That one in the middle?
Hi, thank you. My name's Connor. I'm with Chemonics International. So I have a question. So violent extremism is highly localized and it's personal. It's basically an individual decision to try to use violence as a means to affect change. And CVE programs never kind of operate in a vacuum. So how do evaluators kind of disentangle the effects of their specific program, which are localized and focused on small communities, from broader forces and other localized forces that could be affecting people and making them make this decision? Outside the development community, there's also the security sector might be operating. Like the more violent a context is, the more actors are kind of putting their finger in the cake. So what can evaluators do to make sure they're isolating the impact of their interventions?
Great, thanks so much. Ruth, I hope you got most of that. So we have a couple different questions, I think both getting at sort of this overall terminology issue that I think we discuss a lot in different contexts around PCVE. So wondering if panelists maybe can touch on particularly how the evidence and how maybe evaluators or translating evidence into policy can help shape that discussion a little bit differently. And then also thinking about sort of the proliferation of actors and different forces in these issues, and how can we use what we've learned about PCVE so far to address that or to do that differently. So open it up to.
I can talk a bit about the question about counter narratives. In the specific context of the program, I completely agree with you. And I think that that issue is pretty emblematic of the problems that can occur with P/CVE programming more generally, because it's difficult, as I think other people were insinuating as well, it's difficult to separate the specific program from the broader political environment that it's operating in and the ways that those grievances might be manipulated or portrayed by other actors, including sometimes the US. But in this specific program, I guess counter-narrative is such a loaded term because it recalls the winning hearts and minds strategy. But the program we were examining was more referring to the capacity of community leaders to be able to create narratives around how members of their community can influence community dynamics in a more positive way. So not necessarily creating a narrative that's an alternative to what the VE groups are saying, not even necessarily directly tied to what violent extremist groups are discussing or trying to get the community to believe, but just offering an alternative story about how young people specifically can influence change in their community, if that helps.
I'll try and go a little bit down the line of questions. In terms of counter narratives, with USIP's Peace Tech Lab, we monitored communities in Mombasa, Kenya, on hate speech lexicon. So exactly what were the terminologies they were using, VE groups, to incite violence. And I will just say to you right now, within a 5-mile radius, the way that VE groups were using different lexicons to impact different communities was absolutely stunning. So in terms of our ability really to get at a counter-narrative strategy, I think it's highly problematic, exactly for the reasons you said, that we tend to conflate or work at larger levels when these lexicons are going on at very, very localized levels. The other thing that came out of our study is it is not enough just to have a counter-narrative strategy, that violent extremist groups use narrative as part of a system of recruitment. So they will enable the environment through the narratives, but then they will reach out to individuals. They will bring them to the mosque where they're given more material when they're then included. So counter-narrative absent a system of intervention is absolutely futile, absolutely futile. That's what our study showed. The final thing I'll say around your talk about isolating the effects of your programming, I'm going to say I just think sometimes theories of change should say, if this, then this, then this in this particular context. Okay, and that's what I think is often missing. Are we doing programming that's appropriate for the context we're working in? So if you're trying to do programming on individual radicalization while security forces are bombarding a community with disappearances and extrajudicial killings, then your level of effort should be raised up to here. It shouldn't be at the local level. Okay, so really I think we need to be adding to the theories of change in this context. So that's what I would say to you about isolating your programming and the effects. Let's see. I think, what was the other question? Well, if I think of an answer or the question, if anybody has it, I'll come back to it. But here.
How to balance what donor wants, is that what your question was? It's very difficult. I think we're all in the same. It is, yes. Well, I'll try to answer it. I think it is very difficult to balance it, but at the same time, what we had done is we have tried to do one of our pilot programs that just recently ended, and I'll be happy to tell you more about it afterwards. We did a lot of research, and we went into the communities, and we really worked with communities to find out what do they think is VE, how they see it. And then only after that stage, we designed programs with the local partners based on what the findings were, to appropriate to the context. So I think if we do have that luxury, I think we don't always have that luxury, but if we do have that luxury of doing that research in advance and then tailor the program based on what the findings are, that would be an ideal situation. But unfortunately, it's not. So there is maybe talk to clients and ask them if they would be interested in doing this.
Great. And Ruth's been super patient, so Ruth, it's all you.
Okay, thanks. Just to pick up on a few points, on the sort of sticky issue of terminology, I think that will continue to be an issue. And I think sort of two ways to deal with that would be, which previous speakers have already spoken to, about who defines those terms, is at Alert we have a say what we see approach. So what do these things look like? So in a specific context, how do different groups define violence? How do they define extremism? And so on. And then these, even within a specific context, will look very different depending on who you're talking to. Men, women, people of different ages, authorities, local leaders, and other groups. And then really sort of the issue of making sure that those are defined in terms of practical, tangible things rather than words. I mean, I work in a context of trying to sort of unpack the term resilience is really complex. And then this issue of who defines what VE is, constitutes a VE actor, is also complex and depends on a number of things. If you think about Lebanon, the idea of legitimacy of different groups depends on your perspective and where you sit in those conflict dynamics. But what I think is useful is taking it back to what are the conflict dynamics in that context as a first place, removing the VE lens, and then how do you situate VE within that? So, for example, in particular areas of suburbs in Tunis, there has been recruitment amongst young people perceive themselves marginalized. At the same time, they're also at risk of dropping out of school, drugs, migration, being at risk of being victims of violence, and suicide. So the risk of VE needs to be contextualized with those broader dynamics. That may not be the most useful lens to address the problems you identify. And then on the sort of contribution attribution question, here is where context monitoring is really important because it helps you situate the changes that are taking place, whether they're related to your program or to another intervention or to broader changes in the dynamic. And then using different approaches, for example, attribution analysis to assess to what extent your intervention, somebody else's intervention, contributed to that change, how significant that change was.
Great. Thanks so much. So we'll maybe take one or two more and then close it out. Any other questions? Or not? That's fine too. End of the day. All right. So I'll just say that, so many of the things that I'm hearing is that there's really something to this question of individual versus community, and what are we trying to get at there, and how are we trying to program toward communities and individuals within them, and where is the line, and how are we distinguishing that? I also heard it takes a lot of ifs. I think many of those statements had quite a few clauses in them that make them actually grammatically incorrect, and so it takes a lot of ifs. It takes a lot of factors that I can think about. A lot of communities in much more developed countries that wouldn't have all of those conditions, and so how are we trying to get at the real systems approach? I do think it's correct, but it just makes it that much more challenging. And something that I also feel like I heard is that this sort of collective action and the idea of sharing this learning is really useful, and so we'll continue to think about ways to do that. So I would just open it back one more time to the panelists if they have anything in closing, and I'll start with Ruth. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think just to reiterate the last point on the importance of sharing learning and sharing that evidence and data.
Just say thank you for attending, and thank you to Laura and the fellow panelists. And yes, as I said, we scoured for publicly available evaluations and ended up with 14. So I think sharing learning is really important, and this is a wonderful, won't say start, but addition to that.
I just like a plea, having a little bit worked with these communities on the front lines, that we spend too much time, way too much time looking at risk and vulnerabilities, and not enough time looking at strengths and local capacities and what we call resilience. And I think just our conflict analysis alone, focusing on risk and vulnerability, can undermine their sense of empowerment around their own issues. And then the other thing I will say about resilience is I do think that this is a very promising area to unpack. If we can begin to isolate certain resilience factors in certain contexts, then our ability to do prevention will dramatically improve.
So on sharing and learning, which is very important, as Ruth mentioned and Emily did, but also it is important for implementing partners, but also to encourage local partners and also with each other to collaborate when you are working in the field. If you're doing a CVE program and you know that Search for Common Ground is implementing the program on PVE, CVE, it's important to reach out to each other and see how can you coordinate efforts together, how can you learn from each other, and not to do double work, but complement each other. So I think that's very important. And also, of course, we always need more resources for M&E so that we can down the road, evaluate, and see what these programs bring as a result.
Great. Let me just take the last 60 seconds to say personally, we're so grateful that you're all still here at PeaceCon. I'm really impressed that you stuck it out all 3 days. We hope it was a good experience. We hope it created maybe more questions than solutions. We understand that, but we hope it's an opportunity to continue to build the collective action for peace. Please tell us how you felt about this session and all the other sessions through the app. Let us know what you thought. Please continue to network with each other. You can recycle your name badges on the way out. And with that, we'll close out the conference, and thank you so much for joining, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Our panelists. Our panelists. Our panelists. Our panelists.